The true isn't the rational, a core epistemic distinction, as featured in the map is indestructible. To be rational is to follow the logic of given premises to their coherent end, but not all premises are true. To be true is to believe in true and corresponding premises, whether rational or not. It is, of course, best to be rational and true, but just because a person is one doesn't necessarily mean the person is the other. Which premises are true cannot always be determined, though note that something can be true even if it cannot be verified. And it is unlikely that people who aren't rational could meaningfully explain why their premises are true. But truth is not true because it can be explained. It is true because it is true, even if the lack of explanation means the truth is meaningless to us and or cannot be known as true. All that aside, the main point is that being true and being rational are not similes. When someone is rational about what is true, it seems like rational and true are similes, but this is not the case. True and rational are not identical, though they often cross like rivers that join and become indistinguishable before parting and going their own separate ways again. When the rivers are joined, there is little difference between being rational and being true, but when they are apart, we can tell there is a difference. Funny enough, that means it is most clear that rational and true are not similes when there is a mistake. Say when a person is rational about what is false or cannot reason about what is true, and yet this is precisely when it seems unfitting to use words like true and rational. And yet this is when we should use them, for this is when we could realize the critical distinction between being true and being rational. Error is when we can glimpse that though we are always experiencing the world as if the true is the rational, that might just be because we lack the capacity to experience how the true isn't the rational, to allude to Hegel and the absolute choice. People tend to say you are being irrational when someone holds a false premise, not you're being rational relative to a falsity. We tend to use language which suggests that we lose both truth and rationality at the same time, as opposed to losing one and not the other. In fact, if we did lose both when we were in error, that would easily be a much better place, seeing as we couldn't think we were being rational except when we were being true. The moment we slipped into error, our rational justification would vanish. We must experience the true as the rational and the rational as true. For if we think X is true, then it is rational to believe X is true and act accordingly. And if we think Y is rational, we think that Y reflects truth. And yet the truth and the rational are not identical. But language and experience would have us rationally conclude they are. A great problem, seeing as confusing these concepts hurts our ability to speak, critically think, and empathize. Section 1. What is rational is relative to the framework through which a person views the world. In other words, what is rational is relative to what a person believes is true. If a girl believes the world is going to end tomorrow, it would be rational for her to spend all her money. If a boy believes the stock is going to triple in value, it becomes rational to invest a large sum of money into it. If a person believes that he is in danger, it becomes rational to do whatever needs to be done to get out of danger, and so on. What we believe is the case determines which responses are rational. What is rational is relative to what a person thinks is true, and relative to what a person believes is rational. So a person comes to define what is irrational. If a person believes his wife is going to yell at him if he speaks to her, it becomes irrational to say anything. If a girl believes the boy she likes will ask her out if she sits next to him during lunch, it becomes irrational not to go to lunch, and so on. The rational and the irrational are relative to what we believe is true and false. And when what a person believes is indeed actually false, acting irrationally could be more true than acting rationally. Not to say the truth always comes out. As we'll explore, though, it might be best to drop the term irrational altogether, seeing how easily it can blind us to the problem that is the distinction between true and rational, but I'm not sure. People aren't always rational relative to their frameworks, for people make mistakes and might even intentionally act irrational, say in Dostoevsky. But which is rational is always relative to their frameworks. but what is rational is always relative to their frameworks. We cannot believe X is true and at the same time believe X is irrational and or Y is rational. Yes, we could believe X is true and yet do Y, but that's not the same as believing Y is rational. If we believe X is true, then we must believe X is rational, but all the same we are still free to do Y. Though we cannot keep the true and the rational from organizing one another, please do not mistake me as saying that therefore we must do something deterministically, but that is not the case. The true must define the rational, but that does not mean we must act rationally. Perhaps we should, but actually it can be good that we are free as such, because if our notion of the truth is wrong, it's possible for what seems to be irrational to be best. We must define rationality relative to our frameworks, but not all frameworks are ultimately true. Furthermore, most people are rational and true about most issues and things in their lives. This cup, which is a cup, will hold my coffee, for example. But regarding some matters, a person is only rational or only true. However, all the things a person is rational and true relative to can conceal the individual from the times when his or her being rational and being true do not align, easily persuading the person through daily experience that the two beings are the same being. Arguably, for 99% of our days, the true is practically the rational, and yet even though the categories might overlap incredibly often, the categories are still not identical, even though we can most of the time safely get away with living as if they are practically identical. Unfortunately, so habituated when the categories don't overlap, we can miss the break, contributing to tribalism, ideology, and the like. In a discussion with Johannes Nieberhauser titled On Human Flourishing and Ecastic Time Being on the topic of Heidegger's being, Nathan Mikulak asked us to imagine that we were walking down a street and just for a second we saw ones and zeros scrolling vertically through the air. Mr. Mikula asks us to imagine that this unveiled to us that we were in the matrix, but then tells us to believe we never saw the numbers again. Would that matter? Not at all. The glimpse would be enough to entirely transform the nature of the world and our lives forever. One glimpse, 1 second, and nothing would be the same again. Nathan's incredible point is extremely relevant here, for even if 99% of our lives we practically experience the rational and the true as identical, one single instance of experiencing them apart would prove the categories are not the same. This logic permeates a philosophy of glimpses in much of O.G. Rose, where the emphasis is on fleeting moments and evanescent experiences that forever change the possible nature and meaning of life, moments that we might have to condition ourselves to experience, as stressed in Conditionalism by O.G. Rose. All the same, moments compose life. Errors, mistakes, ironies, these are the moments in which we can glimpse that the true isn't irrational, but the moment we do, it becomes rational to think irrationality occurred, and thus the glimpse is gone. To use Heidegger's example, the hundreds of times we use a doorknob and it works sets us up to be caught off guard the one time it doesn't work. Since doorknobs usually work, redefining a doorknob as that which doesn't open doors because of the one instance seems silly, and indeed regarding doorknobs it would be silly. But epistemology is different from things. For while the experience of a broken doorknob would unveil that doorknobs can break, this experience would not redefine the entire horizon of possibilities which can be applied to doorknobs. We all know doorknobs can break. That's just a part of a thing, being a doorknob. However, many of us live our entire lives believing the true is the rational, for indeed that is what we readily experience. It is not an at-hand thought that the true isn't the rational, but if we can glimpse that distinction, then everything can change. If we see the color green for once in our life, then the color green exists and must be included in our understanding of the world. A possibility we glimpse for the quickest of moments is enough to prove that what we glimpse exists and should be incorporated into our understanding of life. If we notice for a second that the true isn't the rational, then we cannot conflate them in our epistemology. Even if 99% of the time they overlap, we must still maintain distinctions. Indeed, the hundreds of times being rational and being true align successfully seem to make it unnecessary to define them as distinct. Yet, unlike with doorknobs, this redefinition is necessary, and failure to do it sooner has resulted in misunderstandings about the market, ourselves, and each other. Furthermore, the failure to take seriously glimpses has contributed to us failing to establish a philosophy of conditionalism, as discussed throughout O.G. Rose, which focuses on rare moments and occasions to ground and consider new ontological and epistemological possibilities. But that is another topic for another time. The thousands of times the true is the rational gives us reasons to live as if such is the case, and this indeed practically works, even if it is not technically accurate. It's hard to imagine us living otherwise, for what would it mean to live as if the true wasn't the rational? We'd be psychologically overwhelmed and constantly uncertain. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to function. For the sake of functioning, we are naturally oriented to assume the true is the rational. Indeed, this is practically the case, for the categories overlap 99% of the time. But they are not the same categories, and the 1% of times they don't overlap, if we don't realize it's possible for them to divide, we will not be ready, and we will lack the hermeneutical tools necessary to understand what is happening. Furthermore, the experience of a break between the true and the rational is instantly consumed into and interpreted by rationality as irrational, which means not even experience will readily give us reason to believe the true isn't the rational. To achieve this revelation, we must remember that we genuinely believed X was true, and thus necessarily had reason to believe acting like X was true was rational. This is critical. If we believe X is true, we must believe rationality is defined according to X, which is to say we simply cannot believe acting like X isn't true is rational. Rationality must be shaped according to what we believe is true, and yet what we believe is true may nevertheless be false. We're stuck practically living as if the true is the rational, even when the true isn't the rational. We're naturally stuck, which means realizing the true isn't the rational requires us to think outside of what we are stuck in, and that is the critical role of memory, imagination, abstract reasoning, non-rationality, and so on. A society lacking in these faculties will be unable to escape being toward the world as if the true is the rational, which will be fine 99% of the time. But then, Section 2. What is rational is often also what is true, but they are still distinct. Rivers that cross, merge, and become indistinguishable until they part again, but the rivers are still different. And most of the time, what is rational and what is true overlay. So if we look for examples when they part, we may not see them. Making these instances more invisible, the times they do part are the times when we, ironically, might think it is unfitting to use the terms rational and true. These are the times when we think the proper terms are irrational and wrong versus, say, rational and wrong and or irrational and right. Again, most of the time, the rational and the true merge and work together and become invisible to us like a working doorknob, Heidegger. And the times they don't merge are the times when we don't think the categories apply. Because of our preconceptions, we make the times invisible when the difference between being true and being rational becomes visible. Knowing the truth entails knowing what is invisible, but that means truth requires memory and abstraction, two acts of the mind which can be associated with being impractical, even delusional, further worsening the invisibility. The rational presents itself to us as true by virtue of being rational. It has a structure and likeness to truth, for reasoning is through which we come to know the truth, though that isn't to say the validity of the truth is contingent upon reasoning. Reason, in a way, is a language through which we hear and learn about the truth, which is to say rationality is the words through which the truth is understood into meaning. And as the word cat is easy to thoughtlessly confuse with the object cat, so it becomes easy to confuse the rational with the true. Furthermore, without the language of reason, the true that we know and experience wouldn't really be experienced as the true, for the very idea of true and false dawns upon us when reason dawns upon us, which, ironically, is precisely what can conceal it, a dynamic similar to how the word cat is through which we can better understand the object cat while simultaneously hiding the object as it is to itself behind the word. Until a person reasons, the person cannot consider the idea. It is true, a cup is a cup, though the person many times could experience the truth of a cup to some degree. Without reason, a person can experience true things, even if not entirely, but not really experience them as true. And it is precisely because reasoning gives us the language by which to understand things in the world as true that the reasonable can be so easily confused with the true. Our rationality from our premises can conceal us from our premises. What is rational is relative to our premises, and it is our reasoning from our premises which can conceal our premises from us. It is our reasoning from what we believe is true that can conceal from us the question of whether what we believe is in fact true, which is to say that thinking is the act in which the validity of rationality must be assumed and could be correct, and so it is the act in which the truth of assumptions paradoxically manifests and hides a double action, which threatens critical thinking and yet necessitates it, as defined in On Critical Thinking by O.G. Rose. As it is the very working operation of the doorknob that makes it invisible. It is the very reasoning about truth which hides truth as distinct. But unlike a doorknob, which becomes visible when it breaks, when the true and the rational break apart, rationality instantly hides the break. Doorknobs cannot conceal their brokenness. They stop working, after all, which is to say the doorknobs can break in themselves, while rationality only breaks against. Doorknobs in themselves cannot deny their shortcomings, while rationality always can. Any hole that opens in rationality can instantly be covered. But all the same, there was a hole we could glimpse and glimpse through, changing our understanding of what's possible in the world. Rationality must appear true, otherwise it wouldn't strike us as rational, and thus it must always appear to be the case that the true is the rational. By extension, the true appearance of rationality is projected back onto our premises, making them appear rational, and thus that is the case to us that the true is the rational. We experience both our reasoning and our axioms as evidence that the true is the rational. Of course, our true premises might reflect actuality, hence why there is always reason to believe the true is the rational, even if such is not the case. Anyway, the point is that the act of reasoning from premises is the same act that makes our premises appear true to us and yet invisible, for the premises appear to us in the rationality as if there is only the rationality, which makes us confuse the rational coherent with the true correspondent. Our reasoning doesn't appear to us as true because our premises are true, because the soil from out of which the plant grows is healthy, but because reasoning by definition is clothed in trueness regarding the validity of the premises, the plant makes the soil look healthy, though it might be unhealthy. Additionally, we don't tend to think about the soil, only say the flower is healthy or the flower is sick. And yet without reasoning, the premises we hold that are true would be meaningless to us. To make those premises meaningful, we must reason. Flowers die without soil and yet are not reducible to soil. But if we reason, we must hide our premises from us in our rationality, invisible, and yet there is a sense in which the whole point of reasoning is to make the truth visible. Our efforts to make the truth visible cost us the truth, its distinction. To know the truth is to know what is invisible. Section 3. We have described rationality in this paper as being relative to what we believe is true, but that begs a question. Can we rationally ascribe to truths? If rationality is relative to truth, meaning it emerges more after truth, how do we select our truths? Certainly, we can be rational relative to truths, and must be, but can we be rational in selecting truths? It would not seem so, because truth is needed before rationality can begin. Sure, there are instances in which the rationality of a previous action contributes to why we select a new truth now, and that rationality, as influenced by a previous rationality, a chain linking choice to choice can be formed. But eventually there had to be a first mover. Even if not, I personally often find myself having to make choices and decisions which are a result of having to respond to something unexpected, a lawnmower not working, a child asking to play a game out of the blue, and so on, or having to respond to something emotional, aesthetic, or having to look up the meaning of words, which requires me to read a physical book, not just think about the possible meaning of the term, and so on. There are numerous occasions where to carry myself well in the world, I have to take into consideration occurrences which happen because of my embodiment and because I am a person in the world. If I was just a head on a stick, these events would not occur. For me, reason is always embodied and imworld, per se, and that suggests why autonomous rationality is not the case. When I am surprised by a flat tire, it was not reason which brought me to the truth of a flat tire, but experience. Where I sense I need to speak with someone sitting in the corner, it is not reason which moves me, but empathy and or intuition, for the person is smiling, and I cannot readily observe that the person is trying to hide pain. When I behold a glorious sunset a glorious and beautiful sunset, I say that is beautiful, not because I have a clear and a reasonable definition of beauty, but because I am moved by an apprehension, and so on.
Now, the moment I experience a flat tire, it is reasonable to replace it. As the moment I intuit someone needs attention, it is reasonable to speak to that person, and so on, all of which is to say that rationality instantly and quickly consumes my non-rational thoughts, feelings, and intuitions as if they were always rational, thus making it easy to think that all I ever did was reason. The role of the other epistemologies vanish just as soon as I think about them, and before I think about them, in what meaningful sense can I say they were present? To realize their role, I require memory and reasoning about my reason, which in a way suspends it. I must meta-reason per se, and realize that I couldn't have used reason alone to determine my tire was flat, for that thought had to come after the experience, which required my sense and perception. I reasoned about the experience, but my reason didn't cause the experience. My reasoning required something outside of it, such as intuition and aesthetic experience. We require more than reason for reasoning to be possible, but we always reason about what is more than reason to understand it, thus making it seem to be reason. Reasoning is certainly a tool by which we can approach the best cliff from which we might make a Kierkegaardian leap of faith to something, but reason cannot be the leap itself. We have to leap each and every you. What constitutes the you? In double apostrophes, a host of experiences, choices, thoughts, processes of reason, and so on. The answer is particular for each person, and why a given person chooses the premises that the person chooses can only be known fully by that person, not to say everyone knows, for the subconscious is powerful. If a person believes numbers are real entities, reason brought the person to a cliff from where the person could make that leap, for reason showed the person that numbers accurately reflect reality, that numbers are useful, and so on. But it is ultimately the person who makes the leap of faith. If a person believes a friend is angry because of how the friend looks, how the person speaks, and so on, though reason might gather the evidence, it is the person who ultimately leaps and accepts the premise, my friend is angry, whether true or false. Reason guides each you, but it is a risky guide, for reason naturally makes everything appear to be a product of reason, and so naturally misguides us into thinking rationality is all we need, which is to say that the true is the rational. Really, the true isn't the rational, but this is not a realization which rationality will naturally guide us into. It will require memory and meta-reasoning about rationality itself. The impossibility of autonomous rationality, which is when the true is the rational, is not something which rationality will naturally lead us into concluding. In fact, rationality naturally leads us into believing in autonomous rationality, which thinkers like Hume and Benjamin Fonda admonish is consequential. To avoid this, we have to glimpse and remember the breaks between the true and the rational, neither of which will prove easy to do, precisely because rationality will keep consuming and incorporating into itself whatever thoughts we might entertain. Our very phenomenological experience of understanding is part of the problem. Bertien's donkey is an excellent thought experiment for showing why rationality cannot provide its own grounding, despite how we necessarily experience such as being the case. In that experiment, a thought experiment, a donkey stands between two equally sized piles of grain and starves to death because the donkey cannot make a rational decision. In reality, we know that's silly because we can just eat something, but that's the point. We're not bound to only reason. We can realize that the truth is we have to eat, and so we can then eat from a pile of grain, even if we cannot give ourselves good reason to eat one pile versus the other. The you breaks the statement, per se, and the you cannot be reduced to rationality, even though rationality is a critical dimension of each you. I am certainly not saying that rationality is bad, only suggesting that rationality outside a dialectic with truth can prove incomplete and prone to arise to problematic autonomous rationality. We cannot reason without premises, and it is not the case that every possible premise is purely rational, even if every premise is instantly translated into rational terms once encountered, rightly or wrongly. Ultimately, rationality itself can never leap to the true. Rationality can only bring you to where you can leap, and each of us leaps with our truths about life. You can only be you, per se. Section 4. Everyone is rational because everyone operates according to what they believe is true, which includes characters in Dostoevsky who believe it is true that they should rebel against what they experience as true. Indeed, we could still be Dostoevsky's underground man and knowingly act irrational, but this would still be an act which showed how being true and being rational were distinct categories, because Dostoevsky's protagonist knowingly acts within the gap and finds reason to do so relative to some mission. No one is irrational And though I think there is use for the term irrational, I sometimes think it would be best to deconstruct it and only use terms like wrong or incorrect. Yes, if I know I need to be at work at 8 a.m., it's irrational to plan an elaborate breakfast at 7:50 a.m., but in some respects it's more so foolish and the wrong thing to do. If I indeed plan an elaborate breakfast at 7:50 a.m., I have for some reason reasoned that this is fine and respectable, and a respectable course of action. Maybe I've convinced myself that I can eat fast, that getting fired from my job would be a good thing, or maybe I've lost track of my schedule. Hard to say. It just simply doesn't seem possible to act irrationally, especially if we isolate the term from wrong or suboptimal. The term irrational seems to be a description of a choice, not a thought process in of itself. No one irreasons per se, but reasons poorly, and that means rationality is occurring, just missing the mark. We often talk as if we can be rational or irrational, as if both rationality and irrationality are thought processes, but there is no thought process of irrationality. If we think we can either think rationally or think irrationally, then it becomes easy to blur rationality with truth, because rationality becomes the thought process which gets us to truth, while irrationality is the thought process which gets us into falsity. This is a mistake resulting from a problematic dichotomy that we need Derrida to deconstruct. Rationality gets us both into truth and falsity. We cannot separate rationality and truth over here and irrationality and falsity over there. We experience rationality and truth and rationality and falsity. The term irrationality can confuse us. Worse yet, it can tempt us with self-righteousness, for we easily see rationalization and irrationality in others, which trains us to think we would see it in ourselves if it was there, when all we ever experience is rationality. Perhaps people are irrational relative to some scope, but nobody thinks irrationally. If we get from X to Y in our thoughts, we somehow think this transition is rational, otherwise we wouldn't make the jump. Now, image X could flash in my head followed by image Y, so I'm not saying that every transition of thought expresses rationality, but I am saying that we can only reason about our thoughts, that it is not possible for us to irreason about them. Though I realize many philosophical texts make distinctions between the terms, arguably the verb form of rationality is reason, while there is no verb form of irrationality, a point which linguistically suggests the point I'm making. I must invent terms to discuss irreasoning, as I should, because irrationalism cannot be an action in of itself, only a description. Irrationality and irrationalism are terms which mean bad reasoning, identical in kind to rationality, differing only in quality and degree. No one escapes being rational to their self, not even Dostoevsky's underground man, and yet no one is always right. When we believe irrationality is possible as a thought process, trouble can follow. Suddenly, we can be surrounded by people who are capable of thinking irrationally, which means they are not using the right thought process to experience and understand the world. We, though, must see ourselves as using a rational thought process, and naturally people who think like us will also use that same beneficial thought process. But the people who don't think like us are using an irrational thought process, and not only are they responsible for that, but they're also foolish. If everyone is rational, though, in reasoning relative to different truths, then we can't so easily dismiss the other or treat the other as stupid. When Habermas calls commutative rationality, it becomes more tenable. If we frame others as using an irrational thought process, then even if we want to reason with them and give them a chance, it would all be for naught, because they are using the wrong thought process. And how can we get them to change? After all, they need to be rational to see the errors of their ways. But if reasoning is relative to truth, then suddenly we can be responsible for failing to successfully present them with truth that would reorganize their rationality. The burden of responsibility can quickly shift from them to us, and we naturally don't like responsibility, hence why we might have existential incentive to believe that irrationality can be a thought process. Though I'm tempted, I will not claim that we should never use the term irrational, for indeed the term can mean wrong or illogical, but I would stress that we cannot tell if a person is irrational except retrospectively or from a place of knowing the actual truth, which is a vantage point we don't always have and perhaps rarely do. Yet the use of the term irrational can create the impression we do often have that perspective. That's a problematic impression, contributing to overconfidence and believing the true is the rational, a line and even trap of thought that is already hard enough to escape. Thus, if we are to use the term irrational, we must use it carefully. Section 5. The logic used in the last section regarding irrationality applies just as well to rationalization, and it should be noted that someone reading this paper might argue that false rationality is rationalization. Fair, and certainly rationalization occurs, but rationalization is not a thought process either, but a description. Rationalization can entail self-deception, and religion, nationalism, and ideology can be sources of it. Great evils have resulted from people using the capacity of people to rationalize against them and others. The Milgram experiment, Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt, Compliance, directed by Craig Zoblee, all of these can highlight the terror and power of rationalization. But I would argue that these works only increase the importance and necessity of understanding that the true isn't the rational, for it's precisely language like rationalization which presents it as a thought process versus a description, which can contribute to us falling into these terrors. This is because we must see ourselves as rational, and if this is a distinct thought process to us from rationalization, then we will not see it as possible for us to be engaged in the same thought process, which can lead us into a Milgram experiment or the banality of evil. As a result, we will be incredibly vulnerable to the very mistakes which we will see ourselves as safe from committing. Rationality, truth, rationalization. Do we really need all these distinctions? Well, the lack of them has been costly. For example, let us consider capitalism. It is often said the market is rational, and this sentiment implies something progressive, like the market marches through history toward what is best. Almost deterministically, the statement has become a simile for the market is right. But this does not follow if rational and best are not similes, as we have grounds to posit where the true isn't the rational. Perhaps it is the case that when the market is rational, more often than not, the market is correct. And perhaps overall, the market is the best system available to us for making decisions. All the same, it cannot be claimed that the market is rational necessarily means the market is right. Sure, the market is rational, but is the market rational in what premises it accepts as true and as best? By definition, the market cannot be, for rationality comes after truth. The market must organize its rationality some other way. Now, this doesn't mean the market is always wrong, but rather my point is that the phrase, the market is rational, doesn't tell us much at all. All we can say is the market thinks it is rational, and indeed it must. Conflating being rational and being true, people can determine the truth of a system of beliefs by its logic and rationality, when a person can have an incredibly complex and intricate rational system and still be wrong. Mad Thomas Pynchon views of the world are rational, as is the logic which leads to cults and ideologies. And please note I'm not using the C word because I've been gotten in trouble a few times talking about them on YouTube, even if I'm critiquing them. To resume, decoupling rationality from truth and considering rationalization an independent thought process, we can tell ourselves a fairy tale that we are safe from these threats. Experiencing ourselves as rational, as we necessarily must, we thus gain evidence for ourselves that we are safe from the C word and manipulation, precisely in the act of using what can lead to cults, the C word and manipulation. Experience enlivens and deceives. As already noted, the failure to define being rational from being true has contributed to tribalism and hurt empathy, to the dramatic detriment of civil discourse and rapid increase of partisanship. Being Wrong by Kathy Schultz makes this argument thoroughly and well. If rational and true are similes, then when we encounter someone who we disagree with, we will easily conclude the person is irrational and someone with whom we cannot reason. By extension, the only people we can reason with are those who think like us, and so everywhere bubbles and tribes can form, it's only rational. Democracy requires something akin to commutative rationality, as Habermas puts it, and I see little possibility for that where the truth is the rational, in line with what we naturally experience and yet need to avoid exclusively believing. Where democracy dies, power and force will likely take its place. But what choice is there? The other side is irrational, incapable of thinking. Only force and discipline can steer them in the right direction. Error, manipulation, radicalization, tribalism, all of these are things which believing the true is the rational makes us more vulnerable to, precisely because experience the true is the rational makes us think we are less vulnerable to them. Our experience of our own reasoning motivates us to put our guards down. Tricked by how rationality appears true, we will easily not focus on determining the standard by which we define the rational from the wrong, as we won't think we need to develop epistemological skills to improve our capacities for detecting and experiencing the distinction. We will be more likely to unintentionally rationalize the false, all while we think we reason and ponder deeply, having no reason to think we don't. After all, we reason. But if we realize we are imperfect and fallen, then we will accept our vulnerability, and that paradoxically will make us less vulnerable. The limited are more powerful than the unlimited. Chapter 6. The rational and the rationalized are located on the same gradient of logic, which is critical to realize, for it suggests that we can end up rationalizing precisely because we are rational. Perhaps we could say rationalization is explanation devoid of experience. In fact, the better we are at reasoning, the better we might be at rationalizing. When we consider the thought processes as distinct, we don't have to worry about this mistake, which perhaps suggests that we separate rationality and rationalism to avoid existential anxiety. Once we start realizing reasoning and rationalization are both expressions of rationality, everything changes, and the world becomes much more complex. Vulnerable as reasoners to rationalization, how do we keep the scale from sliding toward rationalization? It seems very difficult, requires critical thinking, a willingness to stand against authority, who might have much of the rational public on their side, empathy, self-skepticism, all of which seem especially difficult to possess in a world where being rational and being true are conflated. Still, danger is unavoidable. To use reasoning is to be at risk. Where there is reasoning, there must be the possibility of irrationality and rationalization, for these are part of the same thought process. If we avoid rationalization entirely, then meaning and logic are lost to us, which is to say we will be safe, but perhaps less human. If this is best, we will not be able to think about it being best. Meanings require risk. To think is to play with fire. To reason is to summon the force behind both totalitarianism and the modern world. To advance, as Hegel warned, we must use what could hurl us downward. The rational and the true are not always identical, but since everyone is one of the rational to themselves, also experience themselves as one of the true, contributing to problematic tribalism and social fragmentation. If rationality always appears to us as true, and if truth always appears rational, how can we tell the difference? On Critical Thinking by O.G. Rose argues for a posture that asks questions toward the very way thinking structures reality toward us, and I believe this understanding of critical thinking inherently trains us to understand that there is a distinction between the true and the rational. The same applies to us grasping the distinction between thinking and perceiving, as argued in On Thinking and Perceiving by O.G. Rose, which also suggests a divide between the true and the rational. Generally, we can view the epistemological project of O.G. Rose as an argument for why we need to be dialectical, which indeed aligns with the project with Hegel. Where there must be a dialectic, we must be skeptical of ourselves, and that skepticism itself can help us glimpse the break between the true and the rational. Ideas are not experiences, though, and so what we glimpse will be, a second later, an idea to us which our rationality can incorporate into itself as evidence that the true is the rational. Avoiding this trick will require memory in an age where memory has been replaced by memorization. Rational people can be wrong, and idiots can be right. Geniuses are capable of brilliant foolishness, and fools are capable of foolish genius. Life would be easier if being rational and being true were actually the same versus us only have to experience such, but life is not so simple. Perhaps a desire for control has contributed to us allowing the conflation of being rational and being true, but then all we must do is be rational to rightly organize our world. And we all have the capacity to reason available to us. But if the true isn't the rational, then we have to look outward and take the world seriously, and who knows what the world might do? No one, which suggests why we need to keep our eyes open and minds active, even when it seems like there is no need. Most of the time, the rational and the true practically align, like crossing rivers. So often, in fact, that society can get by well enough without the epistemological distinction. When things are good, indeed, we get by, but things don't always go so smoothly. If we aren't ready, when things fall apart, we'll likely defeat ourselves. In conclusion, we naturally experience the true as the rational, which is to say, realizing that the true isn't the rational requires us thinking in ways which will seem unnatural and wrong. We will have to fight that impression, and we can do that by remembering glimpses of when the true and the rational broke apart, glimpses which transform the entire horizon of what's possible in the world and what the world is like, but only for as long as we remember what we glimpsed and keep that memory close. If we do, we can realize that irrationality and rationalization cannot be thought processes, only descriptions, and suddenly we will stop having to be captured by the impression that others rationalize, while we are only ever rational, which is to say we can suddenly start to realize why it is we only ever see rationalization in others, but when we catch it in ourselves, we experience rationality correcting us. And so we can make ourselves less vulnerable to deceptions, manipulations, black swans, and overconfidence. In this way, we can do our part to help make possible a diverse and pluralistic world that doesn't end up in endless conflict and misunderstanding, seeing as a world without a distinction between the true and the rational must logically turn the other into a fool and/or threat. Our constant experience of the true as the rational naturally makes our experience of others difficult and tense. But if we can remember what we glimpsed and bring that idea in memory to what we experience, we can transform what we see, even though the man's face we stare at doesn't change at all, until perhaps we smile. For the rest of The Map is Indestructible, please find the playlist on YouTube, and there is a list of the sections on Medium. And for more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth. On Amazon, you can find our books. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.